Welcome back to the next video in our UI UX no code pillar series. Now we're going to be talking about repeating data lists, and this is only one UI component. Despite that, this video is the longest video in this section, and that might sound a little bit overkill, but I think once you see just how crucial repeating data lists are, you're going to understand why I chose to do it this way. Now this element is not only present in every single app out there, it is also much more customizable and much more powerful than you might realize at first glance. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is, what it can do. I'm going to talk you through some examples. Before we click into this video, if you haven't already watched the databases pillar, then I really need you to go do that before you'll be able to understand this. And similarly, if you haven't watched workflows, I highly recommend that as well, especially around about if statements and conditionals, because they're going to be incredibly important to understanding how a repeating data list works and functions. So without further ado, let's click in and find out what it's all about. So what is a repeating data list? Well, one of the most common building blocks of any no-code app out there, indeed any app, you know, code, no code, whatever, any app out there is going to be essentially just showing data in a repeat format. I've used the phrase here uniform, and what I mean by that is just showing data over and over again in the same way. You know, you look at Facebook's newsfeed, you look at Twitter, it's the same thing. It's one post and another post and another post and another post, so on, so forth. And the actual repeating element could look like absolutely anything. You know, it could be, you know, a series of bits of repeating text and images like we've got on Facebook and Twitter here. But it really could be anything. It could be repeating maps that are showing all sorts of different locations. You know, there's all sorts of stuff that you can use this for. And so down the left here, I put some, you know, some common examples of this you've seen. You know, Facebook's newsfeed is repeating data, Google search results, auto traders car listings. There's tons more out there, you know, Airbnb's, property listings. Anything which is the same piece of data repeated over and over again is going to be a repeating data list. They are everywhere. And so what a repeating data list does is it goes through every record, iterates through every record from a particular database table, and then for each record it creates an item visually on the list. So if you wanted to show a list of users and you have got a users database table, then you would use a repeating data list and it would just go through every single user, and all of that information from each record is available for you to do with whatever you like as a variable. Now I want to kind of go into the anatomy of repeating data and just get stuck straight into an example and show you how this works. Now we have got some other videos where I visually demonstrate a filter working, a repeating data list working, and I'll sort of show you just exactly how it fits together, some of the different options you've got. But we're going to go through an option here in the slide deck. So hopefully you've used Twitter before. If you haven't, and I'm going to assume the majority of you have, but if you haven't, just as a quick example, Twitter is essentially one giant feed. You follow people and other people follow you. Once they follow you, you can see their messages, or tweets as Twitter calls them. Tweets are generally, up until recently, were limited to a certain number of characters. I think you can do as many as you like now. But when you log on, it's just this one single page of tweets again and again and again and again. So if we were going to have our own no-code Twitter, and I think we actually somewhere in the content library have a demo video of this, so we will actually execute this on camera. But if we were going to build a Twitter clone, then this is kind of what our database would look like. So within our Twitter database, we're going to have Twitter users table and a tweets table. Now under Twitter users, we're going to have the username, i.e. as you probably have seen, everybody on Twitter's username begins with @. So on Twitter I am @Niall, @ being the little email style sign. So you're going to have a username, you're going to have a profile name, you're going to have a profile picture. So the username and profile name are going to be text, the profile picture is going to be an image. Then you're going to have several relationships. So you're going to have a relationship with the tweets table to obviously be able to tell which tweets came from this user. You're then going to be able to have a relationship with other Twitter users who are going to be your followers. And then you're going to have a relationship with other Twitter users who are following, who you are following. So we've got a few bits of data there, a few basic relationships, and then on our tweets table, we would likely have the text of the tweet. So what did they write? You know, welcome to Twitter, or I've just made my first Twitter, whatever it might be. You're going to have a relationship with the Twitter users table that says, well, who tweeted this tweet? Was it at Niall? Was it at John? Was it somebody else? You're going to have the time and date that the tweet went out. So clearly, what's the created date of this tweet? When did it go out? What time was it? What date was it? You're going to have a relationship with Twitter users, which could be anybody on Twitter, which is the retweeters. So who hit retweet on this tweet? And then you're going to have a number of likes. Now, one thing to say, this is an example of what Twitter's database will look like. In reality, Twitter has hundreds of millions of users. It's probably a lot more complex. There's lots of little features, like for example, trying to figure out who you could follow that you don't already follow. You know, that's going to be a lot more complex. All sorts of these features will be complex, but you think about the basic Twitter product, which is, you know, tweet, read your timeline, look at tweets, follow people, have people following you. This is all you need. It also shows you, by the way, just how capable a product you can make with a really simple database. So we've got a few pieces of data and a few relationships there. Let's go and have a look and see how a repeating data list works on Twitter. So this is a screenshot from my Twitter. Completely random, bunch of random people talking there about all sorts of different things. Some incredibly fantastic advice. Most people who can't handle being challenged are the same people who don't believe in themselves. By avoiding small confrontations, we learn to fear the larger ones. That's a good one. Anyway, so let's go into how this would work from a repeating data list. So just in case it wasn't clear, actually, before I go on there, this big bit in the middle is a repeating data list. It's a tweet over and over and over again, but they're actually 3 repeating data lists. 3 repeating data lists on this page. Now, one of them's kind of cut out, but up in the top right here, if you use Twitter, you'll know this, but up in the top right is a list of kind of trending stories, etc. Now, you can only see one because of the way that I've screenshotted this, but I can promise you there were another couple above it. So that's a repeating data list of stories, but down here we can see the full repeating data list. We've got one of who to follow. Now, this is just a suggestion of various different people to follow. You've got Coinbase, which is a Bitcoin exchange. You've got Digital World, I've got no idea what that is, and you've got Jen, who happens to run a really cool personal finance app called Lunch Money. So it just gives you a few suggestions of who you can follow, and that's just like a repeating list again. Let's go into the anatomy of the list now. I'm just going to move this over here so you can see. Now, this might look a little bit confusing, so feel free to pause and just take it in if you need to. I've tried to kind of draw the colours on here. So first of all, each little box that we have on the screen here, I'm just going to annotate, actually, this might help me. So, you know, here, these are all individual tweets. They all fit within their own little box. Each box has got these repeating elements here, so on and so forth. So those are our individual tweet records. Every one of them comes out of one individual record from our tweets database. We then have the content. Now, if you remember from our Twitter database, we had within our tweets table, we had a text for the tweet content. So that's what you're seeing showing up here. So you can just imagine whoever's coding a Twitter, they're going to have a variable set up here that says tweet content, show the tweet content, show the tweet content. If you think back to the demo, we did around about variables with Adalo. And you remember it sort of, I made it say hello Niall, hello John, etc. And it come up hello full name. Well, if you were doing this in Adalo, you'd probably have something that said tweet content. It would say tweet content, tweet content, tweet content, tweet content. And that is the placeholder, the variable that we then put this text into from the tweet content on the tweet table. So with that in mind, we then have a few other things that are immediately obviously coming from the table. We've got our pictures, so our profile pictures down the left here. Each of these is just a little profile picture pulled from a table and added. And by the way, just as a tip, clearly, if you watched the Webflow video, you have saw me making a circle with a picture in it. This will be a div block made into a circle. It will have an image set as a background image, which will be the profile picture, and then it will obviously be placed when it needs to be placed. So you've got the profile picture, And interestingly, this is going to be a repeating list of tweets. Now, this is where this starts to get a little bit in depth. This is a repeating list of tweets, not of Twitter users. So therefore, in order for us to pull through the profile picture, the person's name, their username, we have to use the relationship to the tweet table. If we didn't have a relationship, we wouldn't know who wrote the tweet, and therefore we couldn't show these details. We could only show the tweet itself. So each of these elements on this repeating data list will be pulled through by going to the relationship and pulling that and selecting that data. And so that's quite important, because if you use a no-code tool, it's probably going to say, so you drag your repeating list in, it's probably going to say, you know, which data source would you like to take this list from, which database table would you like to take it from. Okay, and then when you show each piece of data, you're going to be able to say, okay, well, I want it from the current tweet, but I want to go to the current tweet's relationship with the user and take the current user's profile photo. That's how that is going to show up and work. And again, we'll probably see that in a little bit of a demo. So in addition to that, we've also got the profile name, as I mentioned here. So we've got profile name here, profile name here. We have got the username next to it. So again, that's just going to come out of the Twitter user table that we find via the relationship. Now, a couple of interesting things to note down the bottom. We've got the time set up here. So this is just the time and date. It's just going to be showing, you know, essentially they all have a time and date set, and this is simply showing the date relative to the current time. So, for example, at the time this picture was taken, Shane Parrish had tweeted his words of wisdom 40 minutes previous. And again, if you remember from the kind of demo I did on data types and variables, on a Adalo, when we put a date in from the database, we had the option to set the time to relative. So again, no-code tools will probably let you do things like this really, really easily. I mean, Twitter's the kind of thing you could throw together without code in half an hour. That is really the power of these tools. So you've got the number of likes right here. And by the way, don't get discouraged by that. I could throw it together in half an hour. It'd probably take other people a little bit longer. So don't let that discourage you. You get number of likes, so this is just going to pull that number from the tweets table. You'll get time and date as discussed. So, you know, to me that just gives you a little bit of a view of exactly how this fits together. Similarly, if we were to look at this list on the right hand side here, you know, if we were to look at this list here, again, this is going to be the profile picture pulled from the users. This is going to be the text. This is just a button that will execute something. You know, it will probably make them follow me, obviously. So it just gives you an idea of name, you know, picture. This is just another idea of how a repeating data list could work. So let's carry on a little bit and just learn almost how these start to look in no code. So, you know, clearly Twitter's been coded by hand by a programmer. You know, clearly this database isn't exactly real. It's all done very differently. But I want to just talk about how these look in no code, because every tool broadly does them the same way, but they've got different names, different kind of ways of working. And I'm just going to move my picture back over here so you can look at my pretty face in your top corner. So repeating lists, as I say, they can be found in pretty much every no-code tool ever. If a no-code tool doesn't have this, it's going to be incredibly basic, and you're going to struggle to build advanced apps in it because it's so fundamental to everything that you do. Now, just listing a few popular no-code tools here. Clearly there are many more, but Webflow, we'll call this a dynamic list. And I've got that little screenshot down the right of that working. So that's pulling in blog posts, but as you can see, they've not been styled yet, and that's sort of, or they've not had any components added in, but you can start to see how it's coming together. Bubble calls these repeating groups. Now, I'm not a massive Bubble user myself at time of filming. There might be Bubble experts who these might work kind of differently. I can't massively comment. Adalo calls it a list, and I've got the example screenshot there. Really, really simple. A lot of them do call it lists. Zapier calls it a loop. And Glide calls it an inline list. So you can see, clearly they're all called lists, but nearly. They're all kind of pulling out the same name. Zapier calls it a loop because Zapier is fundamentally a workflow builder first and foremost. And when you really think about it, these loops are just exactly, you know, they're just a visual representation of the loops that we discussed in the workflow section. Now, let's march on a little bit. There's exactly what I'm saying. So yeah, you know, loops are, these are just visual loops. You're just telling, the no-code tool to go through every record in a database table that matches whatever criteria you've set. Like for example, pull all the tweets from the last hour, and then you're saying for each record, show me a fresh item in the list, designed however I want it, and with all the data in the right place thanks to the variables. And this is just a really important thing. I've mentioned it previously, but just to keep the terminology right, every record that we show within a list we refer to as an individual list item. So let's crack on and have a look. Now, you can see already those are pretty powerful. It's pretty cool. Where repeating data lists start to get uber powerful, really mega good, is when you start thinking about different operations you can do on them. Every repeating data list out there, I think every no-code tool that has them will do this. To be worth their salt, they certainly need to, but pretty much every no-code tool that I've seen has 3 key operations that you can perform on a repeating data list: sorting, filtering, and limiting. Now, if you've worked much with kind of spreadsheets or databases, you're probably going to be familiar with some of these. If you haven't, that's okay, we're about to explain them. We will kind of go through them in detail and talk through them, but you can kind of think of them not just as operations that you do on, they're not just wee configurations or tweaks that you do to the list. They are in some ways a building block of your app. They are a fundamental functionality building block, and what I mean by that is you can use them to do very different things. How you filter a list is going to completely change it. How you sort a list is going to completely change it. I'll talk through some of these as we go through, but generally they're all kind of available. And on the right here, I've put a couple of options or a couple of examples of how they look. So on Webflow, you can see we've got filters or filtering. You can see we've got sort order or sorting. You can see we've got the limits. We've got paginate there, which I'll talk about later on as well. Similarly with a Dalo, okay, it looks a bit different, but it's the same thing. What's this a list of? Filter it, custom filter, sort it, maximum number of items, which is a fancy way of saying limit. So let's go through these one by one. So sorting is probably the simplest. It is really hard to have used a spreadsheet and not run into this before. In fact, it's really hard to use computers for a long time and not run into this. If you haven't seen it, fair enough, but you'll probably have seen this somewhere, and essentially it's just this idea that if you've got a list of things, you can decide which order to sort them in. Typically you can sort in multiple orders at once, so like I've shown here, you can do it alphabetically, so A to Z, and then you can also sort by kind of smallest to largest for a number. Sort by in this particular field, by the way, happens to be a number. So you can sort things in all sorts of different ways. Now, if we look at the Twitter example, what you might want to do is sort it so that the newest items come out first. And again, you look at that and go, well, why is sorting important? But actually, when you think about Twitter, that's a critical part of the app, is that you always see the newest tweets, or in theory, you should always see the newest tweets at the top of your timeline, and you achieve that by sorting the list in a particular order. So it's by far the easiest and kind of simplest, but you can add as many filters as you like. Most apps will let you sort ascending, descending, by number, alphabetical, etc. There's usually a lot of different options in there. Now let's look at limiting. Again, it's fairly simple, fairly intuitive, but essentially this just lets you limit the number of items shown on a list. So let's have a quick flick back to our Twitter example. On the right here, this list could be infinite. Who to follow? Well, if you're suggesting people eventually, that's going to be everybody on Twitter in some infinite point in the future, but it's just suggesting 3 people. So that list is limited to 3. On the other hand, our main kind of Twitter feed has no limit on it at all. It's not limited. It will just keep showing you tweets and tweets and tweets until people stop tweeting. So if we go back to where we were, limiting. So yeah, you can essentially use this to limit whatever data you're showing. The other thing that you can do with this, and it might not make much sense until I show you, but if a variable in the way you want to use it isn't fully supported, technically what you could do is add a list into the no-code tool and then limit it to 1 item, and you can then just show the variables based on what the repeating data list does itself. So as an example, we have this part of the NoCode.Tech website called the Tool of the Month. And the way that we store our tool information in NoCode.Tech is on Webflow, and we store it just as different data items. So we've got a database of tools, and each tool is a record. So Bubble is a record, Zapier is a record, Glide's a record, etc. And what I do for Tool of the Month, because Webflow doesn't support variables out of the box, so what I do is when I want to show Tool of the Month, I only want to show one tool. So I put a dynamic list in there. I set it all up the way I want it to look. So I've got the I've got the header that says Tool of the Month, and then the tool name, then I've got the picture, etc. And then I limit it to only one item. So it just looks, if you went and looked at it now, which it should be there under NoCode.Tech/tools, if you went and looked there now, you'll see it just looks like a box. But, it does not look like a list. And I think that's one of the key things to drive home about repeating data list. Don't get kind of narrow tunnel vision into thinking it's got to look like a list. It doesn't have to, because a repeating data list item is just going to be an empty box. It's just going to be an empty container. You can design it whatever way you like. You can put whatever you like into it. As a completely random point, you could have a list of countries, and you could have a repeating data list which makes every item look like the country shape, and you could turn that into a visual globe. Now, you'd have to have some pretty serious design skills to pull that off, but I'm sure there's going to be a designer at some point watching this thinking, yeah, I could probably do that, and it could be you. So, don't think of a repeating data list as it has to be a list. Yes, it's going to be multiple things. You can limit it to one, but you can make it look literally however you like. Just treat it like another container that you're doing whatever you want to. So a couple of things to mention on limits. They are purely numeric. You have to say show me 1, show me 2, show me 10, show me 5. For anything more complicated, really sorry, I've clearly not finished the slide. I will fix that, but for anything more complicated, you need filters, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. You can often choose which record in the database table to start showing a list at. So if you've got a list of 10 things and you want to limit it to showing 2, you can show 2 sort of from anywhere in the list. So if you don't want to show the first 3 and you want to show the 2 that you want to show are 5 and 6, you could say start the list at number 5. That's a little bit complicated to say out loud, but if you play with it in a tool, you see what I mean. But you can just sort of start that limit wherever you like. So if you've got 100 items, you only want to show item 99, you can just say limit at item 99. And the other thing just to talk about is pagination. It's not always supported in no-code tools. It is supported in many of them, as I've said. It's not always supported, but pagination or pagination is this idea that you ever go on like a news website or something like that, you read down all the articles and it says next, and you've got page 1 through to several hundred. Well, that's pagination, and it's essentially this idea that you limit the number of items that can show up in one page, and you force the user to click next or click previous whenever they hit a certain limit. It's a really good way to show a massive data collection or a massive list without having an infinitely scrollable page. Most no-code tools that will do it will build it in automatically, but you could custom make it by having a list, limiting that list, having a button at the bottom that says go to the next one, and then limiting the next list, but starting it at, let's say your limit per page was 10. The first page would start at 0 with a limit of 10. The second page would start at 10 with a limit of 10. The next page would start at 20, so on and so forth. So you could do that. Hopefully you don't need to, because that would be a bit of a pain. Now let's look at filtering, and if you've ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, well, here you have Niall Frater's hierarchy of list filtering, and essentially this pyramid is just trying to demonstrate exactly how lists work. But before we get into that, let's look at filters. So filtering is by far and away the most powerful, flexible operation you've got here. Limiting, sorting, pretty cool, but filtering is really important. And essentially, what it does is it lets you control exactly what data is pulled through your list, which means, in other words, it lets you control exactly how users are going to see your data. If you look at Twitter, for example, that is the peak example of a filtered list. That is a list of tweets sorted by newest first, but it's filtered so that you only see the tweets that come from people that you follow or that have been retweeted onto your timeline, etc., etc. So that is a filtered list. it doesn't show you all of the tweets in the tweet database, because that would be literally every tweet ever. So it's just a filtered list based on who you follow. So if you have anything that has user inputted data and you want to curate that for each user, then a filter is going to be your friend. But a filter can do a ton more than that, because a list with a filter on it is literally the core of so many billion-dollar apps out there. Twitter being one, Facebook being another, Google search being another. These are literally all just lists. When you use Google, all it does is list every single search result that's ever existed, except it just so happens to filter it by whatever you have searched. And that's how it works. It filters out everything you don't want, filters in everything that you do want based on the criteria you've specified. So, really basic example I've given down the left here. Take a basic apartment search tool like Airbnb, Rightmove, Idealista, Trulia, whatever's relevant in your country of origin. Typically if you search something like a 2-bedroom apartment, and I've put London here because I'm in the UK, but if you search 2-bedroom apartment in whatever location, the search is going to show a list of apartments. It's just going to show everything from that apartments database, but it's going to be filtered by, do the bedrooms equal to, is the location in London, so on and so forth. And if you remember if statements from our workflows lesson, that's essentially what's happening. A filtered list is just a list of data with a few conditionals or if statements placed upon it, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So, pyramid of list filtering, Freighter's hierarchy of list needs, in other words. So, just really a quick note on how these work. This might seem a little bit over the top, but when you're debugging them, you're trying to make something work perfectly, this is actually pretty useful. So, the way a list works from start to finish is the minute that list is supposed to display, it connects to the data source or the database table to find the data that you've specified. So, if you want it to find your tweets, then it will find your tweets. If you've got an e-commerce store and you want to find all your inventory, it will find that. Once it's got that, it's going to take that whole data that it's got and it's going to filter out anything that you didn't ask for. So if you wanted to take all of the inventory for your e-commerce store, but you only want items that are green, then it's going to filter out all data that's not green. So that's immediately all gone. Once it's done that, it's then going to sort it by whatever method is applied. So if you've got a bunch of t-shirts and one of them is called the A t-shirt, another one's called the B t-shirt, and you've set it in alphabetical order, then the list is going to turn that data around so that of all your green t-shirts, it says t-shirt A, t-shirt B, t-shirt C, so on and so forth. And then it's going to limit the total number of shown items only at that point. So once we've sorted it in the right order, once we've filtered it, it is going to limit the items. The reason that's important there is just because if you limit the items before you've sorted them, you won't know where your limit is. So a no-code tool will sort it and then it will limit it. So if your limit isn't quite working the way you think it should, or your filter's not quite working the way you think it should, play around with them. Make sure you limit it in the right number and that kind of thing, because it can just be really simple to mess that up. Once all that's happened, that's when the list is displayed, and only at that point will any variables be filled in. So if I've got my Twitter example, it's only once the content has been filtered, sorted and then limited that it will then show the tweet, show the profile picture, or whatever other variable I want to include in that list. So just really good thing to know, just so that you kind of can figure out any issues with your list, because the first thing that I do if a list is not working is I try and look at the filter, sort and limit and go, why is it not showing me the right data? What's wrong there? What can I fix? So let's go into a little bit more detail on how filtering works. This might start to feel like overkill if you've really understood if statements, and this is going to make a ton of sense. I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, and if you're struggling with it a little bit more, feel free to pause this, read through the slides, take a look in a bit more detail, play around with it, but I'll go through it quite quickly because it is very similar to ifs and conditionals. So filtering works by specifying one or more rules. I imagine if you had a list of users in your app, essentially what you might do is say, well, only show me the email if it contains Gmail, don't show me it if it does not contain Hotmail, show me the users from our database if the date of birth is earlier than the 4th or the 5th, 1990, it could be absolutely anything. And I've given a couple of examples of Webflow's interface on the right hand side here, but it just gives you that idea of it's completely conditional logic. You put in whatever you want, however you want it to match, and it's just going to start filtering the data like that. Now, well, this is quite a big slide. I do apologise, it cuts off. I just didn't want to add one more slide for a totally little bit of text. But these are essentially the filtering options that you have got. Let me just move that for the first line. So you've got contains, i.e., this checks to see if the list item contains whatever you set. You could only show items from a username database that contain the letter A. You've got does not contain, which just does the opposite. You've got equals, which is an exact match. So if you were running YouTube, that was your app, and you wanted to show the top videos for a search, you could have a list that just says show the video where the rating equals 5 or more stars, or you could equally do show me any video which does not equal 5 or more stars. Again, you can do exists, which will simply check if a piece of data is there. So if you had a website that let you optionally upload a profile photo, like Twitter for example, you could simply show, let's say you could show all the users who have a profile photo, and then you could filter out everyone who doesn't. And that kind of thing can be quite good if you are trying to not have any missing data or mismatched data on your website. You can just filter all that kind of stuff out. Again, there's a lot of text in this. Feel free to pause it and have a look. And then just a couple other things. I guess I did run onto another page then. So one of the other things you just have as an option is a Boolean. Again, we've talked a lot about them and just how powerful they are in our data type section, but you can just check if things are true or false. A really good example there, if you wanted to show a list of drivers and you had Uber and you wanted to show a list of drivers but you've only got a users field, you could have a field in there that said are they a driver, yes or no, and then simply show the people who are a driver or who aren't a driver. Simply what Twitter does is it kind of checks, well, does this user follow, does it follow Niall? Yes or no? If yes, show the tweets. If no, don't. So that's just how that filtering list works again, just the same as our workflows. So, if you thought that was complicated, as I say, I'm going to show you some demos at the end to help you kind of fully understand. But the other thing I just want to focus on is filtering by a relationship field. And the reason I wanted to focus on this, because you're probably already starting to get it at this point, but the reason I want to focus on this is just because it's really where a lot of power is unlocked, and it will help you kind of figure out how things relate to other things, because being able to filter on relationships is kind of what starts to make these so incredibly powerful. Yes, you can filter them, you can limit them, sort it, amazing. But once you start looking at filtering data related to data from another relationship, it gets really, really flexible in terms of what you can do. The downside is, in most tools, it's pretty complicated. Adalo, for example, it definitely takes a bit of getting your head around and playing with. But let's take our kind of common example of orders and customers from our t-shirt e-commerce store. Each order is going to have a relationship with one customer, as you probably remember, and one customer is going to have a relationship with as many orders as they like. If we wanted to show a list of the orders, then no-code tools are obviously going to let us kind of filter in all the orders that are placed by a given customer. And that's just purely by going through that relationship. We would just specify something like, here's a list of orders, filter it by the orders where the relationship with the customer is, and then whatever customer we want to filter it by. Now, quite often that's going to be the logged in customer. So quite a lot of tools, and I maybe showed you this in Adalo before, but quite a lot of tools like Adalo, as pictured, will let you select the current logged in user. So if I want to show the current user's orders, no matter who is logged in, then I can specify a list of orders filtered by the logged in user as the order placer. So it just depends what you've got. You might have, who does this belong to, who placed the order, whatever you call that field that relates from the order to the customer. That's what I would filter by. That's what I would display. Another common option I've just mentioned down the bottom there, you could essentially show or hide all the people from a particular database. That was a reference to my Twitter example, that idea of you could show everybody who follows @Niall, you could show everybody who @Niall is following, etc, etc. Oh, we're not quite done yet. As I've kind of said here, if your brain is hurting, this is a slightly simpler slide from the last couple of painful slides. So Just really simply, no code tools will let you stack multiple filters on top of each other. You know, you can say if the username starts with A and it also equals Adam, then clearly those would cancel each other out. But you can essentially use the same and or filters that we use for if statements in our workflows. So you can use them exactly the same way. Webflow has obviously renamed them to all filters and any filters, but that's the same equivalent as, essentially saying here name is Adalo and has review is on, or saying any filters, the name is Adalo or has any review is switched on. It's just exactly the same as if statements, really simple, certainly a lot simpler than the previous couple of slides. So, now that you've had a brief 30 seconds respite from complicated stuff, let's get back into the more complex. Quite often you are going to try and do a filter list. I'm trying to move this out of the way, it's not really working. Quite often you're going to try and use a filter list and it is not going to work. And when I say it's not going to work, I mean it is not going to show up the data as you expected it to. Typically that's just going to be because the way you've thought about it in your head hasn't quite panned out on paper or when you've been creating the app. But there's a few kind of general tips that almost a little checklist that I run through in my head whenever something goes wrong. So first of all, make sure that the data you're filtering on has data in every record. So if you've got a database of orders, make sure there is no order in there which is completely empty or blank. You might wonder how that can happen. Well, it can happen quite often, depending on how you set up your app. For example, if you had an app which creates an order record every time the user puts something in their basket, say for an e-commerce site, and the user takes something out of their basket, you might end up with an order that's completely blank. Now that would be a mistake because you've obviously not set your app up properly if it allows that to happen. But everybody's human, you're just learning this for the first time and it's absolutely the kind of mistake you're going to make. There'll be little silly things like that go wrong. So this doesn't break every no-code tool, but if you've got a blank record, sometimes it doesn't know what to do and it doesn't work properly. So just be careful with that. That's a common issue with Webflow, by the way. If you're using Webflow's dynamic list, and I point it out because we talk about it a lot, if you're using Webflow's dynamic list and you try to use a field which is not fully filled on every individual list item or on every individual record in the CMS, it is not going to work. So just go and check that. Really common thing to look after. If you're not getting the results you want, one of the things that I just do is just reverse the operator. So if I'd said, contains, I'll switch it to does not contain. If I've said equals, I'll switch it to does not equal. And the reason is, sometimes that will fix it in 2 seconds flat and I don't even have to think about it. I just hit it. Does it work? Brilliant. Does it not work? No. Because if it does work, it probably means I just thought about the logic wrong and didn't quite add it up properly. It is worth taking the time to understand why a filter does or doesn't work, but saves you a little bit of time. If you are failing to match something, so if you're trying to do contains and then, the letter A, make sure you haven't done contains a space. You obviously not, you might miss a space, but programming is really exact, or no code is really exact, so the software is going to try and find a space. Some no code tools again will filter that out, a lot won't, so just check it out. And then be careful with the use of the operator contains. It is really good if you don't need accuracy, but it can also bring a lot of false positives. What do I mean by that? Well, if you use contains, then it will look for any word which contains a certain letter. So I might be trying to find the name Adam, and I might say, okay, show me the usernames that begin with the letter A, but that's going to return Adam, Aaron, Adnan, whatever other names, Anthony, beginning with A. Whereas if I do equals, it's going to find Adam and only Adam because that's what I've told it to specifically look for. So contains is quite fuzzy. It'll look for anything that contains the text that you put in there. Whereas whereas equals is quite exact. It will only find Adam if you're looking for Adam. It will only find A if you're looking for A, so on and so forth. So, appreciate that's been quite a long one. My best recommendation is give it a go yourself. I recommend Webflow or Adalo to give it a try, and we'll also link to a demo video on that as well. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon.